So first of all, thank you again to all of our teachers who are joining us right now, and to all of our presenters, and especially to Lynne O'Hara, who is joining us from National History Day. It's great to have you all here. Now, I'm sure a lot of you at this point are used to using Zoom, but the Zoom webinar is a little bit different. So the 5 of us are in here as co-hosts, which is why you can see us. We can also see you as your names, but you're not going to be popping up on camera, so you don't have to worry about that. The way that you can communicate with us, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little button that has sort of 2 little voice chat symbols. It's called Q&A. And if you put a question in there and type it, it's going to pop up for us. So Lynne is going to do her presentation while the rest of us keep an eye on the Q&A chat box, and we'll either address your question during the presentation if it comes up at the right time, or that'll be a place where we can take questions after the presentation is over. The other thing that you can use is, if you look down, you can see just the regular chat box. And we welcome you guys to kind of chat with each other and put things in there as well. But we won't be pulling questions out of there for the presentation. So if you've got a question you want the panelists to take a look at, please put that into the Q&A box, because we'll be monitoring that. We are also recording this session, and we will be making this session available for all of you at a later point in time. You're welcome to share them with your other teacher colleagues. We'll probably be putting them up on our websites. So this will be here as a resource for you in the future as well. So on that note, does anybody have any questions before we get started that they can put in our Q&A box?
Can I ask a quick question to throw in the Q&A box? Teachers, could you just tell us where you're listening from and what's your level of experience with NHD? Whether it's I'm brand new, I just heard about this, to I've done it for 20 years. It'd be really helpful for me to kind of know who's listening.
So I'm going to say, actually throw that into the chat and take a look. Bottom where you type in, there's some different options. Make sure that you're clicked on all panelists and attendees, because that means that everyone will be able to see your responses. So I'm going to Great second year, folks. That's exciting. Wait, oh God, that means that this past year was your first year.
Ooh. Oh, we are sorry. It does not. It's not normally like this, people. We have to say that. Look, if you made it through last year, you could make it through any year of NHD, which is
absolutely
right.
Especially if that's your if that's your first and you made it through it. Oh man,
you are here.
Smooth sailing from this point.
Christine was a champ this year. I loved working with Christine. She did a great job for it being her first year.
Excellent. And I'll give a shout out. I recognize a couple of you for joining our different summer classes. So hello. Those of you who've been hanging out with me online in different settings.
I recognize a bunch of you. Hi for my old timers, Christine and Kim. Christina, sorry. And to Kirsten, this was your first year as well, and you were amazing.
We had, I think, a question from Cindy, who is one of my colleagues in Connecticut, asking about whether there's going to be information available for performance category using videos for contests if in-person contests aren't possible. And yes, Cindy, we are going to be kind of focusing a little bit more about that when we talk about performances. But John and Samantha are part of the awesome group of coordinators who are working on a standardization project in order to have those guidelines ready to go as we start the school year, so that we'll all be on the same page starting off. And no pressure to them at all.
Yeah, none. We'll all probably touch upon that a little bit this afternoon when we break into our groups as by state as well. So just to give you guys a little bit of a heads up of where we're at on that planning end as well. So you want me to go ahead and introduce our speaker here? And
let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, so I'm going to turn my camera off so we can leave this to you and Lynne.
Yeah.
I look forward to doing this with all of you.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us on this grand experiment. My name is John Taylor, and I am the NHD coordinator from Maine. Throughout the 6-day conference, you will meet all of the coordinators, and you already met some of them here as we've chatted as this has begun, that has been involved with planning on this workshop. So I want to say up front that it's been a pleasure to work with all of them. It's been exciting to combine our resources to try to provide the best possible workshop for you. I am currently starting my 8th year as coordinator in Maine, and in doing something like this has always been in the back of my mind. And for years, I've argued that our close proximity and our short physical distances compared to states out in the West could really be an advantage for us. So one of the positives of our current situation is that we've gotten even closer virtually, as you all know by this point. And I'm so happy that my peers in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, and Massachusetts have been enthusiastic about this. So there have been a few housekeeping things already pointed out about how we're going to run the sessions. I do want to point out that, and we all are pretty much experts at this point with these type of meetings, but I do want to point out that for the 6 days of this workshop, the 10 a.m. session is usually going to run about 90 minutes and will feature the expert or our experts for that day. And then the 1 p.m. session is usually going to run about 60 minutes, and that will involve teachers, students, and judges to talk about their processes and their experiences. Now that I've just explained that, though, I will say that tomorrow it's actually reversed. Be sure to use the question and answer box if you have anything. And Lynne has already said that we are more than welcome to interrupt her as she speaks as well. So if there's something that's really hitting home for you and you really need to know the answer right away, please just type it in the box and we'll pass it along to her. Also, I want to point out that if you did not sign up for some of our sessions, but you do decide that you want to now, you do have those links on the agenda that we sent you, so please be sure to just to click in whenever you want to for all the sessions that we're going to have throughout the 6-day workshop. If there is any type of materials that our speakers want to give to you, we will create an online folder and send that stuff out to you as well. And there might even be some times that we will put it in the chat so you'll be able to access it while the program is going on. So I don't want to take up much more time, so I really want to get this kick started, and there's no better way to do this than opening the workshop with one of the hardest working people I know. We are so lucky to have Lynne O'Hara from the national staff joining us today. Lynne's current title is the Director of Programs for NHD, and I'm sure she'll do a quick intro about herself, but the number of programs she runs simultaneously always makes my head spin. So I was lucky enough to see her talk about the Triumph and Tragedy theme a few years ago in person, and I'm very interested in hearing her take on the communication and history theme. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Ms. Lynne O'Hara and give a brief intro on NHD and discuss the theme. Lynne?
Alrighty, good morning, John. Thank you so much, teachers, for joining us and coming to hang out. My name is Lynne O'Hara. I work programs at NHD, which is this kind of weird umbrella and really cool job. So I work on programs that help develop our teachers and students. The majority of my programs are teacher geared. Every once in a while, we can get student geared programs as well. So my job is really helping students and teachers. If I'm really going to introduce myself, I have to be honest. I was an NHD student. And I was an NHD student because in 8th grade, I love social studies. And I had a teacher, and the teacher, his name was Mr. McCoy, said, oh, well, there's this thing called History Day, and you can enter, but if you want to write a paper, it has to be done in 2 weeks, and nobody could write a paper in 2 weeks. Well, I was an 8th grader with an attitude problem. My boss probably still thinks I have a little bit of an attitude problem. And I decided to show him that I was going to write a paper in 2 weeks. And I did. I wrote the paper. It was awful. And I submitted it. And I was a kid who was a good writer, and I was used to getting praise for my writing. And I sent it to the local History Day contest and didn't place, and I came back, and there were all these marks about all these things I didn't do. Well, all of a sudden, I was kind of kicked in the pants, and it was really inspired me and pushed me. And I was involved for 4 more years through high school. I came back as a teacher. So I was a classroom teacher for 12 years. I've taught every grade 6 through 12 except 9th grade. Somehow I avoided 9th grade. I taught the first 5 years at the middle school, primarily 7th grade. And then I moved up to the high school level where I ended up with a teaching log that was essentially half AP US history, high flyers, valedictorian types, and then the other half of my schedule was co-taught, special education, English language learner. You have something weird about you, they put you in O'Hara's class. So I've kind of taught both ends of the spectrum, and I try to bring those experiences to the teacher trainings that I do. So what do I do at NHD? Oh my goodness, I can't keep track some days. It depends on the day. I do a lot of writing and editing, so I'm involved as the primary editor on our theme book, but I don't do any of these projects by myself. I work with an amazing team of people where we work with teachers, we work with editors, we work with retired teachers, because there's no way I could pull this all off by myself. I work with summer travel programs when those come back. I'm excited for them to come back. I work with our online classes, so I recognize some of you as taking some of our summer classes this summer. We have some classes coming up this fall. I'll talk a little bit about more those later. But we want to really get you started through the year. And, you know, I think most of you have at least some experience with NHD. I describe it to outsiders as it's kind of like science fair, except that it's fun because, you know, it's history. So students do research, they pick their topics, they have to relate to an annual theme, and in the end they create one of 5 different types of projects, right? So what are those 5 projects? They write papers. Papers are my favorite because I was a paper writer for 5 years. They also do exhibits. These are for your visual students, those who have the ability to kind of think visually and spatially. Hint, I don't have any of those skills. I'm a terrible exhibit maker. Our documentary students who get 10 minutes to tell their stories and make their cases in multimedia. We've got our website students using our brand new web developer. And then our performance students who like to bring the stories to life. Obviously, many of you mentioned that this was your first year, and man, did we have a doozy of a year, especially for performance and exhibit students at the end. But as John mentioned and as Rebecca mentioned, they're going to be talking more about you. There is a cohort of coordinators and NHD national team members who are working together to create a template and a plan so that teachers will have it in September. So that if students are going to do a performance or do want to do an exhibit, you can tell them like, okay, if it goes virtual, this is the plan, which is going to be so much better than knowing the plan just a few weeks before your contest. Obviously, this year took all of us off guard. But in a way, I think, you know, we're all dealing with challenges. This is not an ideal teaching year by any stretch of the imagination. But one thing that I'm trying to help teachers do is to kind of look at the positives. Because I think we can obsess about the negatives, and honestly, social media is rough right now with teachers. I'm encouraging teachers to stay off it as much as possible. There's, you know, teachers and parents and community members being pitted against each other, and it's getting ugly. But I think as teachers, we've got to kind of step back and say, hey, what kind of cool opportunities can we create here? Because we have students who are off schedule. You might be teaching online, you might be teaching hybrid, you might be teaching live, and then you might be switching between these modules and these types of teaching throughout the year. But I think our theme really hits this because it really is a good year to be talking about this concept of communication in history. I'm excited about this one. This was actually my first theme, that 8th grade project that I did that was so terrible. This was the theme. And I think communication is cool because it gets your attention at first. But I think it's actually a little more complicated than it looks. So what I'd like to do, and whenever I get to go somewhere, so I'm pretending that I'm traveling today, we like to bring in local history examples. I'm a huge proponent of local history. I will tell you that my favorite NHD project, and the one that placed in finals at Pennsylvania State but didn't get to nationals, not that I'm bitter about that at all, but that's okay, that girl doesn't have my job today, is this idea of bringing in local history. My favorite project looked at the topic of school integration, but I looked at it through the lens of the case that developed in my home school district. And I think anytime we can encourage students to look at national or international trends and apply it to local history, it can do some really magical things. And in a year where local is going to be the most accessible, it might be something to think about with your students. Okay, well, one of the things I'm hoping that you've done is been able to take a look at nhd.org/themebook. If you haven't, I want to send you there because we've got all kinds of goodies there. We've got the theme book that's downloadable. If you want the paper copy, you can order it in the shop, but you can download the PDF for free. We also have on there a theme video. This is the first year we created this. It's about 8 minutes long, and it's designed to kind of take the theme book, about 60-some pages, and take it down to about 8 minutes for student use to kind of introduce them to the theme. We also have some other goodies there. We started a few years ago doing a theme organizer, and this is one of the things that I just kind of made up as a, my teacher brain one day, and now we do it every year. So we've got an organizer. We actually this year have 2 levels of questions. Level 1 questions more designed for middle school students, level 2 for high school students. And based on a request from a couple teachers, we just added a fillable PDF version of that. So your students could actually download it, write in it, save it, and send it back to you. So, okay, let's talk about kind of the pieces of the theme. And I think when we think about the theme as a big, broad idea, we've got to break it down and chunk it into chunks that are manageable for our students. So the way that I think about the theme, the first most obvious things that students think about is the idea of spoken communication, right? I'm sitting here, I'm talking to you. And, I think there's lots of cool examples. We pulled the speech from Margaret Chase Smith, the Declaration of Conscience, her speech in the Senate in June 1950. But we also have to remember that communication isn't just spoken, it's also written. And communication, a lot of communication in history is written. It's about letters, journals, it's about newspapers, and it's about communicating different ideas, whether they be political, social, artistic, scientific. So we need to also talk about communication in written form going back and forth. Now, here's the key, and here's something to be careful with. This isn't just about communication in history. We don't really just want, 100 exhibits about the history of the telephone or the Pony Express. Instead, we want to show how communication impacted history. So think about that as you're working through and kicking around topic ideas with your students. The summer class that I'm working on, a historical argumentation webinar series, we've been using a set of sources from the Library of Congress about temperance. So I guess that was on my mind. And we actually pulled from the Connecticut Digital Archive a letter from S.M. Perkins to P.T. Barnum, yep, that P.T. Barnum, in regards to temperance. So that's kind of an interesting way to mix worlds and get your students interested. Communication has to go 2 ways, and this is really key because the second part of the theme is that key to understanding. So when there's communication, there's got to be understanding or lack of understanding, because let's be honest, if I just sit here at my desk and I'm just talking to you and you don't receive, process, understand, or apply it, well, then I've just been talking. Right? So communication really is a 2-way street. We actually found a kind of cool letter. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in the Spanish flu and other diseases given the current situation. So we actually found a letter about preparing Vermont for the influenza epidemic from the American Red Cross. Thought that was kind of interesting. Oh, I'm also going to mention, please don't feel like you need to write everything down. I'm going to send you the PDF of not only the PowerPoint, but also all of these historical documents. If it's something you want to use with your students, go for it. All right, other key things. Communication happens in groups. Gatherings, organization are a key part of communication. Because again, if I'm the only person with an idea and I want to make a change, I probably have to communicate that, gather others, convince them to help spread my message if I want this to actually make a change. I think we have to look at civics and government and the communication of that. I think that's something that students will be really interested in. And we threw a couple different examples of here. On the left, you've got the Clamshell Alliance about restoring a nuclear site. That's from the New Hampshire Historical Society. We've got the idea of civics and government. And I think not just government to the people, but people to the government. From Rhode Island, we found a petition by employees at the Crown Hotel. They were asking for 50 cents an hour as a minimum wage. Oh man, you can imagine the kind of work that involved for, I think they were making about 30 cents an hour. That was in 1946 after World War II. We also found a really cool anti-suffrage calendar from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Because, I think a lot of times if you want to communicate an idea, pop culture becomes part of how we communicate ideas in the 20th century. Couple other things. Language. Language is so important. We've got to be able to understand each other. I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at ways that people with disabilities have communicated over time. So looking at histories of American Sign Language, the history of Braille, and the impacts that those have had on communities of people over time. We've also got to be honest. Sometimes communication works, and sometimes it really, really doesn't. Sometimes miscommunication is a big part of the story too. So we looked at the Battle of Rhode Island from the American Revolution. Do a little studying on that. There was a whole lot of miscommunication flying around, which is kind of why the revolutionaries got beat pretty bad there. And I think we also have to look at this idea of two-sided communication. How are people communicating with each other? And I thought this was a really remarkable picture from the collection at Harvard about a riot about a protest during the Boston busing crisis. So that's a lot of different things. What I'd like to do before I kind of go to shameless plugs, I want to stop and answer any questions that you have on the theme or getting the theme kicked off with your students. And feel free, John and Rebecca and Sam, if you want to kind of jump in and throw out ideas or questions, please feel free to turn your cameras on and do so.
Speaking of shameless plugs, if you're going to go right into that, I do appreciate you discussing Margaret Chase Smith. If anybody does not know, I am an employee of the Margaret Chase Smith Library, so we are the congressional archive for all the papers for Senator Margaret Chase Smith. So the shameless plug will be that if you are interested in any form of communication with the senator, we will be more than happy to provide that with you. Please be sure to contact me.
I have to be honest, John, I didn't know too much about Margaret Chase Smith. I listened to a podcast about her recently, and it was really interesting. She was a really tough broad in history. She was somebody I really wanted to learn more about once I listened to this podcast.
He was a real trailblazer. I mean, not only standing up to Joseph McCarthy only a few months after all of McCarthyism started, but even being the first woman to be placed in nomination by a major political party for the presidency. So, in 1964.
All right.
On a similar vein, I will thank you for the shameless plug of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm going to just throw a little link in the chat. This is our exhibit that was up last year, and it's a virtual version of it, of the suffrage and anti-suffrage movements. And we have all sorts of really fascinating materials on women who are against the women's vote. So I'll throw that in there.
And I'm going to add, we do not have archives at Connecticut's Old State House, so I can't invite people to come research, but I was very happy to hear earlier the mention of P.T. Barnum. Since Barnum served 4 terms in our state legislature and was actually in the building where I usually work, but he was giving a speech when his American Museum burned down, and someone handed him a piece of paper, saw that his museum had burned down, and he kept giving his speech. So it's, I think, though, how we're all kind of jumping in is a good reminder that local topics are a great thing to explore for students. And I know in Connecticut, we're working on our list of Connecticut topics. We're a little behind this year because, as all of us, the spring kind of was hard. But before, by the end of the month, we will have a list of Connecticut topics for folks. And others, not just, it'll be on our website. You don't have to. Any New Englander is welcome to explore, because as John said, we're a small region. You can travel around a lot.
Well, maybe not these days.
Yeah, well, yes, that's true.
I'm not seeing any questions popping up, though. Please add them in. So, Lynn, I'm going to toss in one of my own question. What do you see as some of the pitfalls of this theme, or things that can be difficult for students trying to grapple with it? Because I think it's such a wonderful topic, but in some ways I think you have to grapple with it a little more than, something like breaking barriers seems like it's a little bit easier for students to grab at first. So what do you see as some of those difficult areas?
I think the hardest part about this topic is that it seems easier than what it is. I think at first it's like, oh, this is easy. It's big and broad. Almost anything works. Hint. All the themes are big and broad and almost anything works. But I think the key with communication is to really break it down to say, okay, how does this fit the story? Just because somebody communicated, is that communication important? So I use the example, if I'm standing on a street corner and I promote, let's see, whatever kind of crazy view that the sky is really purple, it's not blue, and none of you know anything, and I'm going to promote my ideas till the cows come home. I communicated that. Did anybody hear me? Did anybody listen? What changed short term? Did things change in my town or my community because I did that? Did things change long term? If the answer is no, it's probably not a great topic, right? Because we want to see things that create change, because that's really the key of history that makes history exciting. And sometimes, honestly, that change doesn't happen right away. Maybe the idea that's communicated gets shot down. So I would talk with my students about the Populist Party. Right? The Populist Party were these radicals, and they had these crazy ideas about changing the role of the federal government and the American people. And everybody pretty much laughed at them in the 1890s. But if we look at their ideas of things like an 8-hour day and a federal income tax, and we can kind of go through their platform, most of their ideas get put into play really within the next 40 years. So the ideas that started off as, oftentimes ideas start as being radical, then they kind of come into the mainstream for debate, and then they kind of go to, you know, things that change in society. And I think that that's an important thing, to help students see what the impact is. And oftentimes too, I think this is a really key thing that we're starting to see. I think it's important to encourage your students not to lock into a thesis too early in the game. Because I think if students do that, then they only go to try to find research that hits that thesis. I think sometimes they have to start with a big, broad topic. Sometimes they then need to narrow down from that topic. And then sometimes what they need to do is, you know, then once they have significant research, then they can go ahead and really consider what a thesis or an argument that they can make.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Lynn. We had 2 questions pop up. So our first one is from Kim. She wrote, in the past, institutions like Smithsonian Learning Lab and Docs Teach have had pages that directly linked to the NHD theme. Will they be making NHD pages this year as well?
We encourage all of our partners to do that. Now, a lot of them are in the process of getting updated. We encourage all of them to have them updated by the end of August. So if you go to nhd.org/themebook, there's that partner resource button. And that's something that we drive, we continue. If you've got good sources that you find, or a group that, you know, is really helpful. We actually just spoke about a few weeks ago with a group at the Rumsey Map Library at Stanford University. And they're actually in the process of building an NHD landing page and homepage for students looking for historical maps. So if you find a good resource that we don't have, please send it our way. But yes, we encourage other groups to update. I can't make any other group update, but honestly, in my experience, about the last week of August, all the pages start to change over. But I would also encourage you, even if you find old things, like there's Smithsonian Learning Labs for Triumphant Tragedy, for Breaking Barriers, a lot of those topics can work. So don't be turned off because it's a different theme. Take a look at the topic and see if there's something that you can twist into this theme.
Great, thank you. And then Nicole asked, are there graphic organizers that we can use to help students get to a good idea, or to check to see if their idea is good?
That's where I think the theme organizer comes in. So this year we kind of use a little cheesy thing. I started off the first year with Volcano, and I've never come up with one quite as cool as Volcano. But this one it's kind of like a detective theme with the idea of searching out a good topic. But yes, when students think they have a topic and they think they've got something that's right size, like think about the Goldilocks rule, not too big, we're not going to study all of World War II, not too small, we're not going to study some obscure general on one day of one battle that nobody's ever heard of, but you've got something that's right-sized. I think the graphic organizer can help, because if you've done some basic research and you can fill in the 6 blocks there, that'll give you a good sense of, yeah, that this is good, this fits the theme, I'm good to go. or, you know, maybe I need to adjust, because sometimes, and actually I think some of the teachers in our historical argumentation webinar series found this when they were engaged in the process too. Sometimes you hit a point and you're like, you know what, this is just too narrow, I've got to broaden it out, or, you know, this is just too big, I've got to focus just on this state or just on this case. And I think that that's kind of part of the research process. I think one of the most frustrating things, but one of the coolest things about historical research, is that it's not exactly linear. There's pieces and there's a process and there's a rough order, but you know from doing your own research, sometimes something works out, sometimes you get taken down another path, sometimes you just end up in a rabbit hole and you have to admit, yeah, I just wasted an hour searching the Library of Congress website because it's so much fun, but this isn't really going to help my project. Right.
Lynn, I got another question for you.
Go for it.
And this is more off the, you had mentioned that you think that pop culture is a good way to study the past as well. And that obviously piqued my interest because I'm a pop cultural historian. But I was wondering if you could give some good examples of pop culture sources that students could use or start thinking about.
Well, actually, I used an example last week, and I'll throw this in the chat box a little later. We're doing this webinar series with the Library of Congress. So I was modeling how to make a historical argument, and I was modeling it using women's suffrage sources. So we were looking, and I was making a case, this is my argument, that the last phase of the women's suffrage movement, roughly 1900 to 1920, that the leaders were using media to promote a new image of women. And then I was using different examples to show that. And two things that I found really interesting that we found in the LOC's collection. One was a postcard. And the postcard depicted two children, little boy and little girl. And the little girl is basically telling the little boy why she should have the vote. And I thought that was interesting, not just that it was a postcard. And you think about where you'd buy postcards. That would be at a store or a shop. And it's communicating a political message. But it's using the image of young children, which says to me it was being discussed not just in Congress or in committee headquarters, but was being discussed in families and in towns and communities. Another thing that I find interesting, and actually we're going to do a webinar with the American Folklife Center towards the end of October, because they have some really cool, unique sources that I think students will be excited about, to talk about songs and music. So, for example, one of the things that we found, there's an awful lot of sheet music that was written and sold for the suffrage movement, both supporting and opposing. So if you think about it, you know, this is a time, this is kind of before radio really kicks in. So people would buy sheet music. It was relatively inexpensive. Most of it was sold for 5 cents or 10 cents, so people could afford it. You'd buy it, but then you're taking it home and somebody's playing it, whether they're playing it on a piano or a guitar, and people are singing. It's a form of entertainment, the same way we'd listen to the radio today or listen to music on whatever device we so choose. So I think that's kind of interesting to see how these ideas are communicated, not just in the formal ways like speeches and pamphlets and flyers, but kind of these informal ways that kind of get ideas into our culture.
Lynn, I have a question for you. I think a big, and I hope I'm not taking us off too much on a tangent, but I think a big question for people this year is that, you know, with the changes in the rules, that now the theme is kind of integral to the 80% of historical accuracy kind of chunk of the evaluation form. Can you talk a little bit about choosing a good topic and, you know, how that change and maybe some of the reasoning for that change in the rules and the evaluation forms? And because I think some people are going to look at that and be afraid and not realize that it's not really that much of a change, but it's, and I'm going to mute myself because I have a visitor here. Sorry, everyone.
I love visitors who come to our programs. Okay. One of the things, and you'll see, and actually I'll show you where, get the link to get to the new evaluation forms. We kind of rolled in. For years it was 60% quality, 20% theme, 20% presentation. Well, now we kind of shifted it to an 80-20 split. And the reason is, now I've been working kind of with a whole group of coordinators over the last couple of years, and actually I've been advocating for it for a while now to really kind of change the way we look at the evaluation forms, to put them in a more teacher and student friendly format to be able to give more feedback. And one of the things we started with was this big long list of everything we could possibly put into it. And the more we worked it and the more drafts, and keep in mind too, we're working with a committee of coordinators at 3 different points. It went out to teachers to get feedback, it went to students to get feedback. And what we found is that the theme is really wrapped up in the argument, right? It's really about the case you're making about communication. And you know, when you do rubrics, it's important that you don't kind of double dip in a rubric. You want to make sure that everything is evaluated on a separate line. And after kind of going back and forth with multiple drafts, we kind of came to the conclusion that if you try to separate out the argument and the theme, it doesn't really work because they really go together. So the new eval forms, it's like anything that's new, it's going to take a little bit of adjustment. But I actually think they're really powerful because I think they give students feedback. Because even when judges write really good comments, they usually only hit on about 2 or 3 rows of criteria. There's 10 rows. This way, students are getting feedback on all 10 rows. And they can see, just like they're used to in your classes, what do I need to do to move up? How can I make my project better as I'm advancing from regional to state or from state to national? And I'm getting feedback on not just the 3 things that the judge had time to write about, but all of the different criteria. And I'll show you a link in just a second if you haven't seen these on where to get them. I'm really excited to put them into play this year. I'm actually going to be chatting with our coordinators on Thursday about that. All right. Any other questions, or should I hop onto some other plugs and then we'll kind of wrap with big picture questions?
Oh, we've got one question asking to please just kind of restate one more time the 80-20 split, how that's working.
Absolutely.
We'll also be tossing up a link, it sounds like, to the new rubric so you can see it
Absolutely. Yourself. You really have to see it for yourself. But actually, I have one of them sitting in front of me right here. 80% is historical quality. So what that includes, it includes the argument, it includes the research, it includes use of primary sources, establishing historical context, showing multiple points of view, being historically accurate, shows significance in history, the so what, and the new one that we added in is this idea of student voice. Do we hear the student weaving through the argument? Or are they just relying on other historians to kind of do the work for them? So that's 80%. That's the meat of the project. The 20% of the project is the idea of clarity of presentation. And this is what's going to vary based on whether you're a documentary or a paper. And this is where we're going to talk about, like, for example, I happen to have the doc sheet in front of me. The first category, the 10%, is audio and visuals. Can we see your images clearly? Can we hear you clearly? Does it make sense? And then the last category is technical. So this technical category varies. So in a paper, it's more about spelling and grammar and construction. Whereas in a documentary, it's about articulate narration, it's about clearly focused visuals, it's about keeping the audio components balanced. And it's going to vary based on the project. But remember, 80% is the bulk. The theme is part of the argument. I don't think we can really divorce them, because if you kind of mess up on the theme, you shouldn't get hit in 2 places. You should get hit in the argument, because that's really where it comes in.
Thank you.
All right. What I'd like to do is just kind of I call these Lynne's shameless plugs, kind of other resources, materials, things that might be useful to you as you're moving forward into this school year. First one, obviously, I mentioned before, nhd.org/themebook. We've got lots of good stuff there. The partner resource button is linked off the themebook page. If we put anything else up new, we'll put it there. One thing that will come there later this month is we have our big theme webinar. So this is kind of, when I started 8 years ago, it was like a little thing, and Dr. Gordon said to me, well, you'll be lucky if you get 50 people to show up, but don't get too excited. Well, now we get over 30,000 hits on the video that comes out of this theme webinar every year. We work with our friends at the National Archives and at the White House Historical Association, and we kind of present the theme. We look at it from the NHD point of view, and the 2 other partners throw out ideas. This year, we're going to work with the FDR Library. And then we're also going to be working with the team at WHHA in DC to kind of throw out ideas and get students thinking. So here's how it works. We go live on August 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern. We have slots for 500 people in the webinar. It will fill. Last I checked, we had over 250 registered. But we also stream it on Facebook Live, and like all of our programs, we record it and post it the next day. So if you can't get in live, please don't stress. I promise we'll post it on the theme book page, we'll put it on NHD's YouTube channel, we'll share it out via social media. Rulebook. Rebecca mentioned the rulebook has shifted. The changes are not as massive as people think, but we've tried to reformat it and make it even more student-friendly. So make sure you have a copy of the new one, so nhd.org/rulebook. It will be translated into Spanish. That project is actually in process, so I would expect it to be available in September in Spanish as well. All right, couple other things. nhd.org/evals. Get your hands on the new evals. Take a look at them. Make sure your students see them. They don't need to see them the first day of school, but as they're developing their projects, hey, this is how they're going to be scored. You can use this as a rubric in your classroom. It's up to date. It works out. All you got to do is add the point values. We don't have point values on these because they're designed to evaluate at a contest, but it's not too hard to put them in there if that's something you need for your classroom. All right, two other resources that might be helpful to you. If you're doing stuff with women in American history, this is a resource we created about 2 years ago with History Channel. It is 20 women in American history, and all the activities are bell ringers. They are 15-minute activities connected to different women. Check them out. They're a lot of fun. They're specifically designed kind of geared at that 8th, 9th grade level. If you teach World War I, we worked on a big project along with the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. So we've got a book. It is 27 lesson plans, again, written by teachers, for teachers, to look at World War I and the legacies of World War I, which are awful big. So we've got the book. We also have the downloadable. So for each lesson, all the materials that go with it, the primary sources, graphic organizers, rubrics, writing prompts, you can download any one of them that you find interesting, or all of them. If you teach World War II, we've done a lot of work over the last 5 years with the American Battle Monuments Commission. We've helped build a website for them that actually helps tell the story of the World War II fallen and connects it to about 50 different lesson plans on World War II. We've got those lesson plans and videos posted on our site. We also just finished, this has been about 7 years in the making, the new updated teacher's guide to the NHD program. I don't have this one for free. I wish we did, but we've got a new resource and available in our shop if you think that would be helpful to you. All right, online ed. This is another one of the big things that I do. So we launched a brand new course, actually it's going to launch on Friday, called Teaching History Virtually. The registration deadline was yesterday. I've got over 30 teachers in this course, which I'm really excited about. I have about 3 slots left. So if this is something you're interested in, please reach out to me afterwards. I've got to get you slid in this week, but I can get you in if you're really interested, especially if you're in that boat where you just got shifted to virtual, let me know. Our 2 courses that we've got set up to launch in the fall are our Intro to Project-Based Learning class, which is kind of like an NHD 101. It's designed for teachers who are either new to NHD or in the first couple years, and it's designed to help you create materials and products for your students. One thing I'll say about all our courses, I don't believe in edubabble. I don't believe in, let's research this theory and write an 8-page paper about it. No. I believe in creating materials to use with your students in your classroom. It's got to be practical and down to earth for you, or it's not really going to be usable. So in the fall, we've got our intro class. We also have our conducting historical research class. We know that a lot of our teachers may or may not have had the training on doing this kind of research themselves. So what we do is we take a look at the civil rights movement. We look at a case study that happened in Americus, Georgia. But then we charge everybody out with choosing a civil rights topic that connects to their home community or town or state. And then we help you kind of take you through the process of doing the research, developing the thesis, developing the structure for the argument, and in the end you actually write a short form, not full length, NHD paper to put it all together. But the idea is everything you do in every stage is designed that you can show your students. So you can literally create bulletin boards, either real ones or electronic ones, where you show the work, you show the feedback, and the revision process. So that's something that I really enjoy because I get to work with teachers literally all over the world in these courses. All right, I always like to end with ask me anything that will not get me fired. My boss is Dr. Gordon, and please don't get me fired today. But I would love to hear any other questions about the NHD universe that I might be able to answer.
This is your chance, folks.
I will say that Christina has already said that she loves the new rubrics, so she says thank you for that. I also want to point out that the Herstory lesson plan book that you were talking about has been very valuable to me as well. I've been able to get a lot of great ideas to create my own type of lesson planning from that since I work at the Margaret J. Smith Library. So once we went virtual and started creating lesson plans, it was a really good way to get a lot of really good ideas to create my own lesson plans there. So.
And sometimes lessons that you find online get just way too big. And the idea behind these is, here's a person, go find a primary source, and then do an activity with it. Because I'm a huge fan of active learning. And in the classroom, you can have so much fun doing active learning. Because I always tell teachers, think about active verbs, right? If your students are learning, they have to be reading, writing, debating, discussing, drawing, sketching, arguing. It's got to be an active experience. Well, a lot of us are transitioning to online, but we have to figure out how to transition as much of that active learning as possible. It's not exactly the same, but sometimes even little things make a big difference. I know the webinar series we were doing this summer, we've got 140 different people in this series. And on the first webinar, we did basic polling. Hey, we're practicing a concept. Here's the prompt, here's the poll. And it was so helpful. Not only was it engaging for the participants, and actually they really liked it. I was a little nervous they might think it's kind of dumb, but they really liked it in the evals. But it was also helpful to us. So for example, if we did the polling question and you got it wrong, right, I don't really care that you got the question wrong. But that gives me the ability to follow up, to double check, to say okay, you didn't get it right when we did it quickly in here, but when you did your assignment a couple days later, did you get it right? Did you understand the concept? So throwing in those little tricks to get the formative assessment in can really help you with the summative pieces that you're trying to get through. And it's hard because you can't always see, right? When I'm live in a classroom, I can see by body language, by facial expression, by level of interest, if the room's following me or not. When it's virtual, you can't always do that, and that's really tough. So, think about little ways you can kind of plug in those active strategies to get students doing things, and when possible, collaborating.
For sure. So we've had a couple questions come in. So first we have from Cindy. As a regional coordinator, I'm trying to reach out to teachers in my region to provide assistance as well as recruit new teachers. Do you have advice for a teacher who may be considering NHD for the first time in this hybrid classroom model?
Absolutely. Start small. Really, I think if you decide this year is the year that the entire 8th grade and all 400 kids are going to do a project for the first time, it might not be the best plan. Start with a small group. Maybe it's a virtual extracurricular. Maybe you're just going to focus on one class and kind of get through the process, or work with students. Maybe they have an option. They can either take the History Day option or do something else. I think if you start small, get through the process once, it's going to help you to develop the materials and the structure to apply it to a larger group of students. And I would say, don't be afraid to start. Sometimes I've had teachers who started because they have 1 or 2 students who really just were extremely bored in class and they needed something to kick them. I think another way to think of it, and the way I used History Day in my classroom, is that History Day was my skill building. And I have to say, when I got to the point where I was doing in-school judging in January, I used to drag in everybody I could possibly get. Whoever owed me a favor. You were a guidance counselor. One year I got one of the janitors to come in. I got a state senator. I emailed and she said yes. I couldn't believe she actually came and judged at the school. And one of the assistant principals came in. And he had been a friend of mine. He had just recently been promoted. He was a Spanish teacher before that. And it was a Friday. At the end of the day, I was out at teacher professional development. We know what Friday afternoon professional development is. And this friend of mine, who's now the assistant principal, sat me down and he said, "Lynn, I owe you an apology." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I got to tell you, you always talked about this contest thing, and I thought it was a waste of time, and I thought you were spending too much time on it, and, you know, your kids were in the library like every other Friday." And he said, "The work I saw today is the best work I've seen in the building." And I really do think that if you can kind of engage in that process, I got to tell you, that principal was my staunchest supporter after that. Once he saw the students' work that came out at the end, he really bought in. So think about the skills you need to teach students. If they're doing that skill with a topic they care about, the investment on the student part is so much higher. And at the end of the day, I don't really care if they're studying political history or sports history or music history. As long as they're studying history, that's my big win. And they always have that one topic they know so deep and so well. And it pays off in lots of different ways.
Awesome. Thanks, Lynn. So we've got from Emily, one of the most challenging parts of the NHD project for my 7th graders is writing the thesis statements for their projects. Do you have any suggestions on how to approach it with this year's theme?
Absolutely. I think what you've got to do is you've got to model it, right? I think you've got to practice it. So I think you have to start by giving them some samples. So whatever it is you're teaching this week, you're teaching Andrew Jackson. We're going to develop one as a class. And I think when I teach about the concept of the thesis, I think there's 4 things that make a really good thesis. Number 1, it clearly states the topic. If I just read that sentence or 2 and walk away, I know what your project's about. I think the second thing it has to do is set the time parameters. So are we talking about the 15th century? Are we talking about from 1942 to 1944? When are we talking? The third thing is it's got to make an explicit connection to the theme, right? So this year I want to hear something about communication, about miscommunication, about understanding, about lack of understanding, and don't try to hide that. Like, hit the judge over the head. This is my case I'm gonna make. And then finally, and this is the hard one, and this is, I know, Emily, this is what your students are struggling with. Being a 7th grade teacher, I know this was the hardest part. It's got to be an argument and not a statement of fact. We don't just want to say suffragists were pushing for the vote. Well, that's true and it's right. But the question is, how were they pushing for the vote? Why were they pushing for the vote? What strategies and techniques? And I think the key is you've got to help students see the difference between an argument and a piece of evidence. Arguments we can disagree on, right? So John might say, I'll put you on the spot, John, Margaret Chase Smith is important because why? How would you fill in the rest of that sentence?
Actually answer?
Yeah, give me a one sentence. If you're going to make your case, why was she important?
Oh, geez, now you did put me on the spot. She was the first woman to be elected to both houses of Congress.
Okay. So is that a fact or is that an argument?
That's a fact.
That's a fact. So let's take the fact and let's turn it into an argument. That is true. How was she elected? Why was she elected? Why was she successful in that role? What would you say to that?
How or why was she successful in that role? Well, I think she was a very good politician.
Okay, stop right there. We've got an argument, right? Margaret Chase Smith used her excellent political skills to get herself elected to both the House and the Senate. Because that's something we can argue. I can say, you know what, it's not really about her political skills, it's because of her social class. No, it wasn't about her social class, it's really about the way that she had people working under. We can argue and discuss. Once we've got something we can debate, now we've got an argument. So one thing I would suggest, start by doing instruction where you include a thesis, right? Make the argument, project it up to your students or put it on the board. Do your direct instruction, come back to it at the end. Say, did I prove my thesis? Did I make my statement? Then after you do that, a couple days, maybe, and with younger students, it might be a couple weeks. Don't put it up there. Give your direct instruction and then have them work together to figure out what the argument is that you made that day. Then show them. it's going to take practice. And with high school students, it takes about a week or two of practice. With middle school students, it's going to take several weeks of practice, and that's okay. Start it early in the year. Make arguments, make cases. And, ask them to disagree with you. Hey, I'm going to argue, Jackson's communication strategy in dealing with the Indian Removal Act. Is there other points? Oh, wait, we didn't look at the Cherokee point. Well, let's talk about John Ross's point. Let's talk about the point of view of the people, and how does that change or challenge the argument? Because history is a dialogue, and arguments mean somebody's going to disagree, and that's good. Historical argumentation is not like cable news debating, right? It's not about shouting at each other. It's about providing the evidence to support the argument that you want to make. And it's okay at the end of the day if, I make my argument and Samantha says, you know what, I disagree with you. I think you're wrong, and here's why I think you're wrong. Because that's what we want to do. We want to foster that intellectual discussion and consideration with our students.
I think my reaction to that, it just goes to show how hard it is to make a thesis statement on the spot. So to be able to work on it is
and I knew I was putting you on the spot. Thank you for being a good sport, John.
No problem.
Honestly, it takes revision. The first draft is not, and I think sometimes when I present, we have, national winners on the NHD website. I'll be honest with you, when I go to present with teachers, I don't use those examples for the most part. And I do that intentionally because most projects don't look like that in the end. And quite frankly, those projects didn't look like that when they were first turned into their teacher in December or January or February. It's about the revision process that really creates the strongest projects in the end.
And, John, you were talking a little bit earlier about kind of the how the kind of unexpected positives of virtual contests. And for us, it was getting all of the so many examples of regional projects, because we're going to use those to help to highlight on our website for that very reason, Lynn, because we don't want, when we do workshops, we try not to use national winners because they've gone through that whole process. Or sometimes we've had projects that we have seen at various points, and they're also helpful to share when you see the kinds of changes that took place.
Well, and remember too, students can edit anything. You can't change your topic and you can't change your category, right? You start as a documentary, you got to end as a documentary. And you start with the Great Depression, you got to end with the Great Depression. But tweaking, adjusting, changing your title, changing your focus, all of that is fair game and is part of the revision process.
Yeah, Emily says, thank you, that was incredibly helpful. So
excellent. Welcome, Emily.
We did have another question.
Before we go on, John.
Yep, sorry.
I also wanted to toss in for the thesis, one of the things that I think is incredibly helpful is the idea that we have the theme, because I think the theme can also help you make the argument, and you can use it to create the argument. I think that John Adams' great communication skills was key to the development of the Constitution, right? Or I think that the failure to communicate around this battle is what ended up losing the war, right? And then, so it's like if you have that tie to communication, or you have that tie to whatever the theme is, I think that can be sometimes helpful for students to come up with whatever they're arguing, because they're saying it does have to do with communication, and this is why.
And I always tell students, sometimes you have to write in really inelegant ways to get things started. So when you're trying to teach analysis, I would tell my students, just write the phrase, this is important because. All right, that's probably not going to end up in the final version. But this is important because, and get that phrase into your practice helps drive them away from factual or descriptive writing and more into analytical writing. And again, sometimes you just got to get the ideas out and kick them around, and then you can go back and revise and make it flow and make it good. But I use that in live teaching all the time. I would constantly say, this is important because blank, fill in the blank, or why does this matter? So, and I would say all the time, so what? Why do I care? Why do I care about what we studied for the last 2 days? And make your students make the case. What's the impact? What's the short, what's the long term? Because students don't always know what they don't know, but if the more you practice with them, the better they get.
Yes, and that's one of the selling points that I always talk to teachers about when it comes to the theme. I'm in agreement with you, Kate, that it's a good way to to focus in or help the student focus to start creating that thesis statement. We do have another question that actually came over chat as well, and it's from Christina. Do you have any good tips for how to help students discover local topics other than providing those topics for them? The issue is that they don't know what they don't know, and so don't know where to start.
Right. Well, depending on the students you're working with, they might be local. So these might be kids who've grown up in your town or community for 10 or 20, 15 years, and sometimes they might be transplanted kids who really don't know. So I think the best way to do that is to figure out what the students are interested in. Are they interested in political history, economic history, social history, religious history? If you can kind of narrow down, and then kind of through conversation and coaching, drop ideas and walk away. So you might just say, you know, have you heard of this person? Go Google them and I'll come back in 5 minutes. You know, kind of just throwing out ideas, but gearing them towards what the students are interested in. I can throw out that really cool school desegregation case, but honestly, if my students aren't interested in the civil rights movement, it's not really worth it. It's more about tailoring suggestions based on what they, and sometimes, you know, you go with students, what are you interested in? Sometimes the better way, especially for younger students, is to say, what are you not interested in? What do you not care? I don't care if you don't care about military history. I can throw out 10 cool ideas and you're not going to like any of them. Are you interested in the history of sports, the history of people? Are you interested in the history of agriculture or rural life or the history of science? It's not that any one of these ideas is good or bad. It's got to work for you. Because if I can tap into a topic that you care about, it doesn't really matter whether I think it's the greatest or the worst topic I've ever heard of. Because once you buy in, then I get the skill development and the research skills, which as a teacher, that's what I'm looking for.
Christina, I will also toss out there, we on our website, which is getting revamped and will hopefully have a new website up in September for Massachusetts, but we have a number of theme pages from local organizations, including the MHS where I work. And we also have links to dozens of different historical societies and museums and other places around our state. So I would throw out for all of you, the next place to go might also to be talking to your state coordinators and see if they can direct you anywhere. Because we're getting resources and more all the time where kids can hopefully browse through and find things to catch their attention. So yeah, ask your local coordinators and librarians.
I think, too, you know, sometimes starting kids with a broader list, like, hey, I want you to propose 3 ideas to me, and let's talk about them. And then sometimes you just have to say, like, oh, you're interested in this. Have you heard of that? Because then you really have a better response with the students. If you're doing it virtually, think about discussion boards. I have to be honest, I always used to do this little strategy where my students were on blocks. They had 90 minutes in the library, and I got to keep them doing something for 90 minutes. So I used to bring index cards and have them write, like, what are my 3 goals? And at the end of the period, you tell me if you made your goals or didn't make your goals. Well, one time I was going to the library, and I forgot the index cards on my desk. You know that feeling, teachers. So I was like, all right, I'm stuck. I got 5 minutes. I don't have time to run back. The hallways are too crowded. I don't want to catch kids on their cell phones. So we had a class discussion block. So I literally just threw up a discussion question. What are your 3 goals? And it was a dumb thing because I forgot the index cards one day. Well, now all of a sudden, because your goals weren't just going to me, but everybody else could see them, wow, my students worked harder that day. Sometimes those little tiny changes can make a huge difference, and stuff that you don't think is going to matter a darn bit. So all of a sudden, they got in the habit that every Friday we were in the library, they knew there was a discussion thread where they had to post up what their goals were and then come back 90 minutes later and tell me what they did or didn't do.
I would like to point out to any of the main teachers that are here on this webinar that, you know, we all know that this year was the bicentennial for our state, and that celebration is going to be extended into next year for obvious reasons. And so there are a lot of historical organizations out there right now who are focusing in on a lot of local history, and so this would be a really great time to focus in on local history here in Maine. So,
I would also encourage you, reach out, because while you're right, a lot of places are closed or on limited hours or have restrictions, the team members who work there, the education specialists, people want to help. Now, if you just call and say, tell me everything you have about the Vietnam War, you're not going to get anywhere. But hey, I've done some research, and I'm really trying to get my hands on a copy of this series of letters that were written in this year between this person and this person. Because what I have found is that if the team members have physical access, they will often, kind of jump over and go through hoops to try to help you get access to things. I know ed specialists say, well, look, if you email me, I can get the archivist to digitize it. It might take a little bit of time. It's not going to happen, in 24 hours. But a lot of museums and archives are really putting efforts into digitization, and that can only help us in the long run. If there's something cool your students are looking for, ask. The worst you can be told is no. But ask nicely and politely, and if they do help you, teach your students to send a real written thank you note. That's super important that those go out, because then the next time a student asks, especially from your school, the chances of you getting help goes up again.
And I would just say, from the perspective, and my fellow coordinators probably have had this experience, because we actively solicit historical societies and museums throughout the state for ideas. And of course, like many other states, we have, folks, both staff and volunteers from museums who help, and God bless them, judge every spring. I often will get excited emails from colleagues who say, oh, guess what, Rebecca? I had a History Day student come today, and they get so excited. There's certain places, the bigger archives, that always get History Day students, but I tend to get that from, the smaller places where maybe it's a little bit more unusual, but usually a local archivist or a local historian are so tickled by having a student interested in what they have spent their life with that it really, oftentimes they will go far and beyond what you could expect, because they're just so excited to have a student interested in their topic.
I'd like to piggyback off of what you were saying there, Lynn, because our archive, the archive I work at, our research requests have not gone down throughout this time. And our collection specialist is more than happy to be working and digitizing all this stuff and still helping researchers across the country and throughout the world. And so you're absolutely correct. All of these institutions want to help and want to work right now. And so they are more than happy to jump through hoops, like you said, to get the information that you want or need. So do not hesitate to reach out.
And I'm going to say one other thing that I freely tell students. I've seen students, of course, they win with, the big topics, that come up every year. Jackie Robinson, think we could all, probably jump in. Triangle Shirt Race Factory, the ones you see every year. But I oftentimes, at least in our regional and our state contest, we see a lot of the winning topics tend to be, or are local history topics, just because there's such a great access to local resources. Not that winning's everything, not saying that, but it makes it easier to explore. You can take a little road trip and get to, the place where it happened.
We do have another question in the chat box.
Okay.
This is from Christine. I teach European history and ask students to create projects focused on Euro themes. Any suggestions about your favorite resources that might be appropriate?
Yes. All right. My go-to for European history stuff is Europeana. If I'm saying that correctly, that's a great kind of digitized collection of all kinds of stuff. I'm going to actually throw something in. I will pass this off to coordinators to kind of push out. We have built kind of a 2 or 3 page gathering of sources. So we've got U.S. history, we've got European history, and we've got ancient history, all different reliable digitized collections. So I'm going to actually push that out to push over to you. Europeana is probably my go-to when I'm looking for things. And it's a hard thing, because I think a lot of times there's this sense that History Day is American history, and it's not. It's any kind of history. I think the early adopters of History Day in many places were U.S. history teachers, But I think the same way local history can have an interesting and new impact, looking at topics in world history and in European history can also be really, really interesting and different, especially when you can help kids connect to other skills or other interests. Sometimes you have students who might be English language learners but might have proficiency in a different language, and when they can access some of those documents or materials, that can be really, really cool. I know at least 2 English language learner teachers who use History Day as a way to help their students learn English, specifically by tapping into history from countries and cultures that interest the students and where they have background. So I think that's kind of a cool idea. But I'll definitely get that resource page out to you all, because that'll give you way more options than I can remember off the top of my head.
And sometimes we've had students who have explored a country from where their family was from originally. One young man I can think of who's done very well with papers, his family's from India originally, and he's explored some really interesting topics that are Indian history. And, you know, it's a connection with his own ethnic background. And so students, I think, can sometimes find some really interesting topics just kind of looking in their own family history or their country, you know, of origin. And so there have been some really neat conversations between family members because of that.
We did have Cindy who chimed in and did say that another great resource that she uses for her students is that she has them explore the presidential library of whomever was in office at the time of the topic. Have you had any same experiences like that, Lynn?
Absolutely. I think, honestly, at the presidential libraries, find out who the education specialists are. Those are your best friends. You know, hey, this is what we're researching. This is what we're looking for. Is that, you know, we've done some searching. Is there anything where President Nixon is talking to the governments of? Another place I'll throw out, this is kind of a new and emerging museum. We actually had a really cool NHD Explore thing set up with them this year, but we'll have to do it next year. For the National Museum of American Diplomacy. That's basically the U.S. State Department, and all of the diplomatic channels with our embassies and consulates all over the world. They have some really interesting artifacts, and they have a really cool education team who is working to make things more and more accessible for NHD students. They actually wrote one of the articles in this year's theme book. But they have some cool archives that they're digitizing and increasing. They've got a small museum that they have built and that they're actually adding to and will be even bigger in the next couple of years, and they're building their digital presence as well.
Questions as we start to wrap this up? These have been great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for joining us today. I think I can speak for all of us and say this has just been fabulous, and I have so many ideas going forward. And thank to all of you for joining us. So we have recorded this session. We will be making this available. And this afternoon, we'll be getting together and then heading into breakout rooms with your state coordinators so that we can chat a little bit about the plans that we're putting together for this year, and talk about things that might be a little bit more relevant for you, particularly in your state. So brainstorm if you have questions, but I also know that if you have questions to ask Lynn after this, that she would be very happy to hear from you.
Please feel free, shoot me an email. My email is easy. It's Lynne, Lynne, @nhd.org. If I can't answer your question, I'm really good at sending it to the right person. I think coordinators can, a lot of they send me an email, I'm like, nope, that goes here, that goes there. But I'm happy to do that to help get you the information you need. Thank you, everybody. Good luck with your new school year. Do the right thing by you and your students, and it'll all work out.
And we will also be sending out the presentation and the other materials that Lynn used today, so you'll be getting a copy of those as well. All right.
Thanks, Lynn.
For your kind comment. She said, I've been involved with NHD for a while, but this was a really fresh, informative session. So.
Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful.
See you all later.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lynn.